let's just say it's the mid-1980s and I have a great deal of power in the world and I'm opposed to climate change. How might I go about setting up the discussion in the institutions to deal with this problem to make sure that nothing ever happened? Well, I'd do 5 things to make sure we never did anything about climate change. First of all, I'd make sure that the problem was always described as uncertain and maybe, just maybe, it's not necessary, so that whenever push comes to the shove, people could cognitively retreat to this idea that, oh, that looks like it might be hard, maybe we don't need to do it because maybe it's not really a problem. And so this injection of uncertainty all the time is a really good way of making sure maybe this issue isn't as important as we think it is. And I'd certainly go about ensuring and investing in groups and supporting people to attack the science all the time, to create doubt about the scientific recognition of this problem, to make sure that it's continually uncertain, continually doubtful in the minds of the public and decision makers. Secondly, I'd want climate change to be understood as being an environmental problem. It's a problem for fluffy things that live in ecological margins, for polar bears and for species, but it's not really a social problem. And when social issues are raised, if somebody says, well, it is actually a social problem, that it has development implications, I'd certainly want it to be understood that those implications fall on people who live in poor countries, who don't have much power in world affairs, who won't bear the cost of reducing emissions. So that people in developed countries can think, well, if this is a social problem, it's not my social problem, it's not a problem for my society, it's a problem for those poor people out there in the world that I generally don't have to think about, don't have to face. And so that climate change would only be as effective as efforts to solve global poverty, which typically are not particularly effective. So if the world's already destitute, then what's a little bit more destitution because of climate change? So making sure this is always an environmental problem means that it's in some ways a less important problem than it really is. The third thing I'd do was make it known that the cost of solving this problem are very high and will fall disproportionately on rich people living in the world's wealthiest countries. So that it becomes a problem in a sense of people in rich countries incurring costs seem to be a problem, but people in rich countries incurring costs to save species about which they might not particularly care, or save people about whom they might not particularly care. And I'd calculate those costs always in terms of aggregate dollars, the amount of money that is lost, rather than representing them in terms of what they really are, which is slight reductions in projected rates of GDP growth. What's really involved in the cost of reducing emissions is potentially a slight slowing of growth, but growth nonetheless in developed countries. Finally, I'd propagate the idea that the best way of solving this problem would be through a treaty amongst all countries, that we won't do anything until every country in the world agrees collectively and in consensus that something is to be done. And I'd ensure, like most international regimes, that the rules about decision making are unclear, that every country is required to commit to a decision, including carbon superpowers like the USA and China, oil exporters like Saudi Arabia, and highly vulnerable countries like Bangladesh or small island states. I'd ensure that this climate change regime doesn't meet very often, that is designed and run by lawyers, that small countries don't have much capacity to influence it, and again require that only full agreement is a precondition of countries, is a precondition for reducing emissions. So push this into a regime cul-de-sac and wait. And I'd propagate this idea in all the rich countries of the world that we don't have to do anything domestically as a country or as individuals until the international community agrees to act collectively, until this regime that can never reach consensus and never really reach agreement, reaches agreement, we can just wait. So this gives everybody who consumes things, and every firm that consumes things, and everybody who produces an action that reduces emissions of greenhouse gases to do nothing and to disassociate themselves from some degree from this problem, because it's uncertain, because it's an environmental problem, because if it does affect people, it affects poor people who are over there, because actually it might be really expensive. We might incur a lot of cost to solve this problem that isn't our problem in developed countries, and it maybe doesn't exist anyway. And anyway, We'll wait for the international convention to send us a signal that says, yes, the world has decided to universally act, we all agree, and now countries, you have to go. And in this way, we end up with no significant action. We end up with people who are living lives and firms who are producing things and countries who are producing large amount of greenhouse gas emissions, not really doing anything about it. Maybe we don't need to. Maybe it's not our problem. We'll wait for the regime. So we're all excused. We're all waiting for somebody to tell us what to do, and it's never going to happen.